what we've seen in this campaign since day one, since Kamala Harris has risen to the top of the ticket, is joy, optimism. We know that at the end of the day, when all votes are counted, Kamala Harris will be the next president of the United States.
History this morning, 5:30 a.m. on Wednesday, that Donald Trump has won the presidency for a second time.
How did we get here? Or perhaps more to the point, why does this keep happening? I was born in 1992, and the first presidential election I have any memory of was Bill Clinton's '96 re-election campaign. I have a very early memory of my parents and some of their friends crowding around a little box TV with fake wood panel sidings, watching what I assume was the acceptance speech. 4 years after that, I remember what we now understand to be the stolen election between Gore and Bush Jr., and then 8 years later, when I was in high school and just barely starting to develop my own personal politic, Obama won his first term. And I remember, like so many others, feeling fired up and ready to go, as if real, meaningful progress and change was just around the corner. Of course, that never actually materialized, and by the time Trump won his first term in 2016, I had started to develop the impression that politics in the US was effectively just a never-ending tug-of-war, where no real progress is ever made and two entrenched sides, opposed to one another, just battle back and forth over the same few hot-button culture war issues forever. Except I had also noticed by then that every time the balance shifted back and forth and back again, we somehow ended up farther to the right than we had been before. Until now, after this most recent 2024 election, we are unambiguously facing open fascism in all three branches of the federal government. So once again, let's ask the question, why does this keep happening? If both sides of the political spectrum in this country have effectively just traded national electoral victories back and forth over the past 3 decades, I mean, hell, the Democrats are even ahead in presidential terms, 5-4, then why are we now living through a second term of Trump and seeing the Democrats at a national level build their entire platform around merely resisting the most odious parts of the MAGA agenda rather than actually fighting for any kind of positive leftward movement? Now, from a mainstream liberal standpoint, there are a lot of possible answers to this question, many of which I'm sure you will have heard before. The Republicans have the House. The Republicans have the Senate. Okay, the Republicans don't have either the House or the Senate, but they don't play fair like the Democrats do. You know, whatever the West Wing hell that means. Really, a lot of these explanations just boil down to some version of, but the Republicans. And on a surface level, that might seem to make some kind of sense, unless you ask why that doesn't go both directions. If the Republicans are able to stop the Democrats from meaningfully exercising their power when they have it, well, why don't the Democrats just do the same thing to the Republicans? I mean, the Democrats have had a unified federal government 3 separate times in the past 3 decades, which is only 1 fewer than the Republicans. And by contrast, back in the 80s, Reagan never once had a unified government, but we're still dealing with the ramifications of policy passed during his administration to this day. Why are the Democrats specifically so ineffectual at moving us to the left when they're in power and at keeping us from sliding to the right into fascism when they're not? There's going to be a lot of things to unpack in this video, but I think a good place to start might be to just give a short and simple answer to that question. The Democrats, as liberals, will never meaningfully guard against fascism because they are not, at a foundational level, opposed to fascism. Rather, they will faithfully maintain and propagandize for the ideological and societal foundation upon which fascism is built, because it is the same foundation that capitalism is built upon. And liberals love capitalism. So if you've been in political spaces on the internet for any period of time, you've probably heard someone express the idea that the Democratic and Republican parties in the US are effectively the same, two sides of the same coin, you might say. And while that idea is not exactly what I want to talk about in this video, I do think it serves as a good jumping off point for what I do want to talk about, which is the connection between liberalism and fascism via capitalism. So let's start by unpacking that idea, that the two main political parties in the US are functionally the same. Now, if your understanding of politics in the US has only ever been shaped from a mainstream perspective, this idea probably makes no sense to you, because in the mainstream narrative, Democrats and Republicans are portrayed as if they are opposed to one another. And usually this narrative is told in the context of the culture war. Now, there's a lot of different specific issues which fall into the arena of the culture war, and most of them fall under the umbrella of personal freedoms and civil rights. Things like immigrant rights, gay rights, trans rights, bodily autonomy for people with uteruses. There's a lot of issues that basically just come down to, should the state persecute this already marginalized group of people even more, or should it not do that? And should we, in some cases, in some ways, try to make those people less marginalized in society? And to be clear, these are important issues, and Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives do usually differ on them, where conservatives, to be blunt, are outright fascists who openly advocate for enacting violence on people who they view as lesser or inferior in some way or another, and liberals, at the very least, are not usually openly fascist in that same way. For me, this is one of the main reasons that I think saying Republicans and Democrats are literally the same is a bit oversimplistic. I do believe there is a meaningful difference between capitalists who are also loudly and proudly fascist and capitalists who are at least less so. However, the truth being expressed in that statement, and what most people really mean when they say it, is that liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans alike, are all capitalists. Economically, systemically, the farthest left that liberals will go is effectively to argue for a stronger welfare state, to argue that we should subsidize more and perhaps slightly different things than their conservative counterparts. And there's developed this kind of pop understanding, which you may have seen in memes or on t-shirts, that this somehow makes the Democrats socialist, as if just like having a fire department or public services of any kind is socialism. And you need to understand, this really is not the case. The world over, capitalist governments do almost always provide at least some basic level of infrastructure and public services, because otherwise it would, realistically speaking, be very challenging to have any sort of human society at all, which it turns out is actually a prerequisite in order for capitalists to have people to exploit and profit off of. And yes, at times, capitalists will threaten to privatize previously public infrastructure or services, but just because that hasn't happened to every aspect of some society in some place doesn't mean that that state or that society as a whole is socialist, so long as private property, and especially private ownership of the means of production, is enshrined and protected. And I think it's also worth mentioning, so long as the proletariat, the working people themselves, have little to no control over the state compared to wealthy capitalists, which is unfortunately almost always the case in representative democracies, especially ones as deeply flawed as what we have here in the US. Speaking of the deeply flawed representative democracy we have here in the US, however you slice it, realistically speaking, the Democrats are loudly and proudly capitalists, just as much so as the Republicans.
I actually believe that capitalism is the greatest force for prosperity and opportunity the world has ever known.
I'm a proud capitalist. I know America can't succeed unless American business succeeds.
Look, I'm a capitalist, and I know the power of American innovation.
They strongly uphold and make policy based on the myth of a benevolent, meritocracy-based, free market capitalist society. And they do so in such a way where they end up repeatedly just giving more and more control over to wealthy capitalists and corporations. For example, the biggest piece of the Affordable Care Act, possibly the most expansive policy passed by a Democratic administration in the last 3 decades, was effectively just a massive subsidy for private insurance corporations. If you purchase a plan on an ACA marketplace, even if you get a subsidy for that plan, you are still buying insurance from a private corporation who is profiting off of that plan. It's just that now some of that profit is coming from the taxpayers at large rather than you personally, which I think is not how most people would describe the ACA. I'm guessing if you were to ask most people to tell you what the ACA does or how the marketplace works, they'd probably tell you that it somehow brought costs down or forced insurers to be more ethical and offer plans to people who couldn't afford them before. I even know from personal conversation, there are people out there who believe the ACA marketplace is like a public alternative that private insurers now have to compete with, and none of those things are the case. Now, to be clear, I am not saying the ACA was point blank a bad thing. It was a huge piece of legislation with lots of parts to it, notably some important new regulations around pre-existing conditions and a massive expansion of Medicaid eligibility. Even the marketplace piece, which I'm obviously very critical of, did help lots of people get health insurance who didn't have it previously. It's just very important to recognize that this was not done by changing anything fundamental about how healthcare works in this country. Rather, it was facilitated by funneling tens of billions of dollars to wealthy capitalists who are still, to this day, profiting off withholding basic human needs from people who need them. Insurance companies saw their profits increase massively as a result of this legislation. There is no way in which the ACA was anything other than a huge win for those corporations. And I think it's very interesting to note that this is often upheld as one of the greatest progressive legislative victories of most of our lifetimes, when in reality it's pretty par for the course for the kind of neoliberal economic policy that was ushered in by Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan here in the US, and which Democrats and Republicans alike have kept churning out ever since. All of this to say, it is not just with their rhetoric, but also with their actual policies that the Democrats are staunchly capitalist. And so long as they are, it does not really matter how much they posture and message about civil rights, because the people in our society who are threatening those civil liberties, who are pushing us further and further into fascism, are all powerful capitalists who derive their power and influence from capitalism, and as such know that they realistically have nothing to fear from Democrats or liberals more broadly. Even if occasionally specific players are held to account or do lose some measure of influence, it doesn't really change the overall picture, because capitalism is not a conspiracy being facilitated by a small group of nebulous villains at the top. It's a system, a way of structuring power in society built on a foundational set of principles and rules, and it will continue to reproduce itself until that foundation is abolished. Until that happens, we will never be rid of the threat of fascism, because once again, capitalism and fascism share a common foundation. So it's actually a little bit hard to pin down a singular specific definition for fascism. In 2016, the historian Ian Kershaw said that trying to define fascism is like trying to nail jelly to the wall. Personally, I think this is in large part because it's obviously a very charged term, and even in academic circles, there seems to be a focus on trying to describe specific qualities of different movements throughout history which are already agreed to be fascist, rather than on trying to define fascism as its own distinct political ideology. However, with that being said, I think pretty much everyone can agree that at its core, fascism is a philosophy of righteous domination. While the specific details and strategies of different fascist movements have varied from movement to movement, they all have this in common. Fascism asserts that there are certain groups of people in society who simply deserve to be subjugated or oppressed or exterminated because of who they are, because they are inherently flawed. And at the same time, it also asserts that there is usually one specific group of people who deserve to rule, to dominate everyone else.
It is thanks to you that the future of civilization is assured.
The story fascism tells is that society is out of order because the inferior, innately flawed masses of the world are preventing the natural rulers of society from occupying their rightful place. Very often, this story is told through a specific lens that historians call palingenetic ultranationalism, the idea that societal disorder must be solved via a process of national rebirth, or a return to a mythical past when the righteous rulers of society had the power that is rightfully theirs, and when everyone else was properly subjugated. The goal of palingenetic nationalism is to return to that mythical past via the apparatus of the state, to make the nation great again. I would also argue that, especially in our modern era, it's very important to note that this battle does not primarily play out through wanton, irrational, unchecked violence, but rather through the much more mundane, cold-blooded violence of law and order. Over the last century, outright, blatant bigotry has, by and large, gone out of vogue in the cultural mainstream, and what we overwhelmingly see now is this fascist narrative of dominance and subjugation being framed around issues of legality and criminality. Fox News scarcely ever talks about immigrants without also invoking the specter of drugs and gang violence. This is the language of fascism, justifying the violent domination and eventual elimination of inferior, deviants, and criminals by the righteous, upstanding, true citizens of the nation. So that's all pretty intense stuff. And you might be asking yourself at this point, where does capitalism tie in? Where's the domination or whatever in capitalism? And here's the thing. This next part of the video was a little challenging for me to write because I don't know you watching this video. Maybe you think capitalism is great and that it's improved the quality of life for people the world over. If that's the case, then I'm not really sure how you ended up here, and also you're not gonna like this next part, so buckle up, I guess. Or maybe you're on the other end of the spectrum and you're already a committed leftist who falls asleep with a copy of Das Kapital under their pillow each night, and you're already 3 steps ahead of me when I talk about the commonality between fascism and capitalism. Or a lot of you are probably somewhere in the middle. Maybe you think that capitalism is bad, but you're a little fuzzy on the details. Isn't capitalism just having to work a job you don't like for too little money and then going home and spending too much money on rent? But then again, why is it that way? What about capitalism specifically means you have to do those things? I mean, now that you think about it, what really is capitalism actually? As I've already said, in this video, I aim to make the case that capitalism and fascism are built on a common ideological foundation. And in order to do that, for the sake of continuity, I think I do need to give a very abridged description of what capitalism is, to make sure that we'll all be working with roughly the same puzzle pieces as I work to fit them all together. So here we go, speed run. Capitalism is based on private property. Now, when Marx and other leftists talk about private property, it's very important to distinguish it from personal property. In the mainstream, most people don't understand that there's a difference between these two, largely, I think, because of capitalist propaganda meant to make it seem like private property is the same as personal property. But it is not. I think the easiest way to conceptualize the difference between the two is to ask yourself whether you can justify your ownership of something based on your personal relationship to it, rather than by referencing a legal framework like a deed of ownership. For example, if you've ever lived in an apartment and you've talked about it being your apartment, the ownership you're meaning there is personal property. It's your apartment because you live there. All your stuff is there, you have history in that place, it's where you go home to sleep at night. Personal property means that it's your apartment because of your personal use relationship to it. Private property, on the other hand, is the legal construct that lets your landlord say, actually, no, that's not your apartment. That apartment belongs to Nationwide Property Holdings Corporation. This piece of paper says so, and you better keep paying us, or else the state, the cops, are gonna help us throw you out on the street. You can probably imagine how in a lot of instances, personal property and private property are at odds with one another. And while capitalism does not really care about personal property at all, it holds private property as utterly sacrosanct. Private property, as Marx explains, is what forms the basis for the exploitation of workers, which is central to capitalism as a whole. Specifically, when the construct of private property is employed to let people, or now corporations, privately own the means of production, such as land, factories, and other sorts of capital, which go into producing material goods for society. Without the construct of private property, the means of production would instead be managed collectively, communally, and decisions about what to make, how to make it, how much to make, and what to do with any excess would be made for the benefit of all, rather than for the benefit of a tiny, socially elite class of owners, otherwise known as the bourgeoisie. Now, while private property is necessarily central to any true analysis of capitalism, personally, I believe it's not always the easiest thing for people to grasp onto right away, and I think there are a few other key features of capitalism that are also worth mentioning, as they're perhaps a bit more obvious to most people. For example, the way that capitalism encourages the commodification of everything, meaning that nothing in society, food, water, shelter, healthcare, in many ways community even, can be acquired without paying for it. In capitalist society, this is taken as a given, but I also think that most people become at least passively aware of the ways that this butts up against our ideas of basic human rights or human well-being generally. I think another thing most people are probably pretty familiar with is what Marx would have referred to as the alienation of the worker. Many people in this day and age feel like what they do for work, to some degree or another, is basically bullshit, not actually that important. In 2018, the late great anthropologist David Graeber estimated that in our modern capitalist society, almost a third of all jobs realistically contribute nothing of value to society. This really resonated with a lot of people because they are living the reality where what they do day in and day out is not determined by what society actually needs, but rather by what the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, think will make them more money. There's a lot of these dynamics, which I think at this point kind of have a life of their own, and which most people are to some degree or another pretty familiar with because so many people in society are living them. And taken all together, they very clearly paint a picture of domination, of a few select people in society benefiting from the oppression and exploitation of everyone else. A Marxist analysis just helps us make sense of this picture and critique it more meaningfully and constructively, but funny enough, this clear picture of domination is also very obviously present even in the mainstream propaganda version of capitalism that we're all taught growing up. The mainstream story of capitalism is essentially the myth of benevolent, competitive meritocracy. It goes like this: people are lazy and won't do anything at all without an incentive. Because of this, society needs to be competitive and stratified into different socioeconomic classes to make sure that people are incentivized to work hard and smart, to think of new ideas, to try to get a leg up on the competition. When people do this, all of society benefits, because now there are better and cheaper things for consumers to buy. And remember, you too get to be a consumer when you work hard enough. If everyone cooperated to meet societal needs, then everything would fall apart, because once again, people are lazy. They won't work hard without the allure of getting to join the upper classes of society, and they might not work at all without the threat of becoming destitute if they don't. When people have wealth and comfort and power in society, they deserve it because they've worked hard to get it. And when people are struggling or suffering, they also deserve it because they haven't worked hard enough. Now, of course, this story doesn't square with reality. It's also wildly ahistorical and really very easy to poke holes in, but you'll probably find if you do start poking holes that it doesn't really matter to people who have already bought in. The story justifies itself. It's not meant to accurately describe the state of the world, it's meant as a moral argument to justify the domination that is obviously inherent in capitalism. And we can pretty easily see this in the way that a Marxist analysis and the popular narrative don't really contradict each other much at all. Marx describes how private ownership of the means of production leads to workers being exploited, and capitalists don't really disagree. They just argue that the arrangement is good, necessary even.
Capitalism is by definition exploitative. It's how it operates. That's fine.
Leftists describe the existence of extreme poverty in a society overflowing with material wealth and suggest that we could do things differently. Again, capitalists don't really disagree. They just argue that extreme poverty is perhaps unfortunate, but ultimately deserved. After all, if people don't want to be poor, they should just work harder. The main difference between these two viewpoints, philosophically, lies in the fact that one condemns the obvious domination present in capitalism, while the other celebrates it. Now, to be clear, most liberals are not that harsh in their endorsement of capitalism, and you'll very often hear people kind of paradoxically attempt to distance themselves from the cruelest outcomes of the system while simultaneously still holding tightly to the core of that system, which keeps leading to those outcomes. Most commonly, this will take the form of arguing for regulation. The idea that with enough government intervention, the underlying balance of power in society doesn't need to be challenged or changed. The system can just be molded to benefit everyone, or at least most people. Of course, one problem with this is that in a capitalist society, the government is overwhelmingly influenced by wealthy capitalists. So the type of regulations that are even on the table at any given time is, realistically speaking, limited to the types of things that don't actually challenge the ability of wealthy capitalists to keep exploiting their workers and society at large. Even when, on occasion, notable reforms are enacted, they almost always come in a package that benefits affected corporations more than it hurts them, like we saw with the ACA. The deeper problem with this regulation argument, though, is that the society it aspires to, that we're told we can achieve with enough regulation, is the popular myth described earlier, which is still at its core based on exploitation, stratification, and domination. This is where the commonality with fascism lies, and I hope by now the overlap should be easy to see. If fascism is a philosophy of righteous domination, which justifies itself by appealing to notions of a natural, moral order, capitalism is a philosophy of pragmatic domination, which justifies itself by appealing to the myth of a necessary economic order. The common foundation is that they both work to justify the violent domination of the many for the benefit of a deserving few. And in this regard, they bleed seamlessly into one another. They reinforce one another philosophically, politically, and financially. Fascists will always rise to power under capitalism because they are the most willing to exploit others and the least likely to care about the well-being of others, qualities which capitalism rewards handsomely. There is no meaningful anti-fascism that is not also anti-capitalist, and for this reason, the Democrats will never meaningfully guard against fascism. They will, at best, serve as a placeholder, perhaps swapping out some of the trappings, but fundamentally leaving everything in place until the real fascists, the committed ones, take charge again. There's a lot of messaging out there, meant to make it seem like Trump and MAGA, the obvious slide into outright fascism that we are currently living through, is merely coincidental. That it's purely the result of individual bad actors, con artists, who have somehow swindled all of society into giving them the reins and letting them steer us into the depths of hell. The solution, of course, is to rush $20 to the DNC so that they can defeat these megalomaniacs one more time in what is yet again the most important election of our lifetimes. The problem with this story is that it just doesn't add up. It clearly doesn't paint the whole picture, and I think once you've lived through it a few times, you can choose to either keep buying the party line and continually being shocked and dismayed when these kinds of things keep happening, or you can start earnestly asking the question, how did we get here? Why does this keep happening? Any good faith interrogation of these questions will inevitably lead you in a certain direction. It is patently absurd to suggest that it is merely individual bad actors appealing to the darker demons of people's nature that keeps pushing all of society further down the pathway into fascism year after year, decade after decade. There are easy, obvious questions you will run into that must be asked. Why is our society so susceptible to these kinds of demagogues? Why are they able to accumulate so much power and influence over and over and over again? Is that much of society really that racist and misogynistic and xenophobic? And if so, why is that the case? Who benefits from that? Finally, what would it look like if we were to address root causes, to actually make the kinds of foundational systemic change we would have to make in order to break the cycle? In other words, you start to ask the kinds of questions that will inevitably lead you to the resounding conclusion that the only way to truly cast aside fascism once and for all is to cast aside capitalism, and therefore liberalism, right alongside it. I'm gonna end this video with a quote from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who in his letter from Birmingham jail talked about his frustration with liberals. He said, "Over the last few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in the stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice." I think this philosophy, this desire for a negative peace, is really the core of liberal politics. A prioritization of comfort for a few over liberation for all. In a way that almost mirrors the palingenetic ultranationalism which outright fascists espouse, liberals also long to turn the clock back. Maybe not to a time when schools were segregated and women couldn't vote, but just an election cycle or two. To a time when they could still pretend that things were slowly, probably, getting better. That powerful corporations competing with one another at the expense of workers and the environment was actually good for society because it brought down prices. That our political institutions did actually serve the interests of the public. In other words, they want, above all else, to keep pretending that capitalism is good. That it is not, at every moment, just a hop, skip, and a jump away from outright fascism. The problem, of course, is that it is.
Howdy, y'all. If you made it all the way to the end here, thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video, then I would really appreciate it if you hit the like button and also subscribed. And then I do also actually have a Patreon where you can support me a little bit extra if you feel like doing that. I really like making these kinds of longer form videos, but they do really take a lot of time and energy. And so, chipping in a little bit over there, if you're able, is by far the best way to encourage me to do more of these, which I would really like to do. This video in particular took a long time just because there's obviously so much to unpack with these topics, and just finding like a manageable angle and scope for what I wanted to talk about took a really long time. And I actually wrote like almost half of an entire other script before I decided to scrap it and switch to this one. Anyway, if you made it all the way to the end here, then again, thank you for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you all next time.